Thank you very much. So we have roughly 55 minutes for this panel. I'm very sorry, but we absolutely need to stick to wrapping it up at 5:30 because many of us have to move to another location afterwards. So this means that you will have, let's say, 7 to 8 minutes to answer the questions. And first of all, we will have some introductory remarks by my colleague, David Korányi.
Thank you, Jean-Yves, and thank you, Alex, for the kind introduction. First off, let me warmly greet the members of the distinguished panel and all participants of the Second Budapest Forum for Building Sustainable Democracies. And it is my deepest regret that I can't be with you in person due to family and health reasons. But it's my great pleasure to at least virtually welcome everyone at this closing panel of the forum's first day. And it's a panel that comes with a deliberately provocative title, and thank you, Charles, for that. You were the inspiration. Well, I would say this is undoubtedly and regrettably a very timely conversation. And in these very days, we are witnessing a fundamental shift in the relationship between the European Union and the Hungarian government, with potentially devastating consequences for the country's future. I am, of course, talking about the proposed withholding of EU funds over legitimate concerns on corruption and the rule of law. And that would be, in and of itself, a serious blow to the Hungarian economy and society, given the severity of the crises Hungary is confronted with. We can only hope that the EU funds will eventually reach their intended final beneficiaries, the Hungarian people who badly need it. But what is more, it is quite clear that in a time of war, patience is wearing thin within the EU with Orbán's hitherto successful peacock dance that can no longer plug in the widening gap in democratic values, even if he still pulls the occasional rabbit out of his hat. And Orbán himself, despite popular support for the EU,
we have some kind of a problem with the online discussion. Should we wait 2 or 3 minutes?
And thank you, Kati, Charles, Tim, Frank, Mathieu, László for accepting the invite. And I really want to thank my friend and colleague Jean-Yves Camus for taking on the unenviable role of the moderator in such a star-studded panel. And he is, I'm sure you know, is perfectly positioned to lead this discussion for, in addition to his day job at the municipality in Paris, he's also a very renowned scholar who published extensively on the topic of the extreme right and illiberal democracy. So I thank you again for joining the Budapest Forum, and for those of you who are lucky enough to be present in beautiful Budapest, I wish you a very pleasant evening reception. Jean-Yves, over to you.
Thank you, David. My first question will be for Professor Gati. Can you please tell us what is the current day situation between the EU and Hungary? What are the roots of this situation? What are the consequences both for Hungary and for the EU? And where do you think this will lead us to?
Is this okay?
No, you have to move here.
No? Yeah. This is better. Thank you very much. Thank you for the question. Before I attempt to answer it as well as I could, I should say that there are other members of this panel. I'm looking at Tim Garton-Ash, for example, a great expert on the EU and on many other things, who is better qualified than I am to answer that. But before I try my amateurish way to answer that question, let me just say that before this panel, during a brief break, I read a summary of President Putin's speech, and I'm stunned. He's threatening a nuclear war with the West over the Ukrainian crisis. And I hope I'm not I'm just responding to the excerpts that I read, not the whole speech. I have not absorbed the whole thing. But I have to tell you that I'm very upset because it seems to me that we are facing a very serious war-like situation which we have never faced in the nuclear age. So under these circumstances, some of the issues posed for this panel seem pitifully insignificant. I realize that for Hungary, the EU is very important. I realize that for the EU, for the first time in many years, that the Hungarian violations of the values of the European Union is also important. But just perhaps because I'm a teacher of international politics, allow me to say, look out at the really big issues of the day. And the big issue of the day is what's happening in Ukraine, but more importantly, how Russia is responding, how it issues threats, and how, at the same time, the Hungarian government, for example, blames Ukraine, incredibly, and even the United States for this war. It boggles the mind. It boggles the mind, but we have to think of the big issues of the day as well. Now, to turn to the topic at hand, perhaps I should just introduce myself. I was born and raised in this city, in this beautiful city, as Mr. Korányi said. It remains beautiful. It is not typical of Hungary, but it is a wonderful place to live, and especially if you did not care about politics, it would be, I think, the best place in the world. I'm not saying that I'm returning after 60 years of being abroad. That's a little too late. I have had 2 American-born wives, not at the same time, please keep that in mind, 5 American-born children and 11 American-born grandchildren, so I cannot come back here but, to simply enjoy the beauty of this city, but my heart is here very, very often. That's about my biography. Now, for the first time in 15 or 20 years, there is the possibility that the European Union is taking the issue of corruption, the rule of law, and a few other issues, including united action in Ukraine, seriously. How seriously, we do not know. The negotiations taking place now. But what I can do best, while I will make a few forecasts, what I can do best is give you a little bit of historical background about Mr. Orbán and his approach to the European Union. I used to know him very, very well in the 1990s when he was, among other positions, he was the vice president of the Liberal International. Some of you, of course, Hungarians know this, especially old folks like me, but it's important to keep in mind that he used to be the strongest advocate of European unity and served, as I said, in the Liberal International, as well as many other places as well. That's why we had so strong hopes that Hungary will be able to rejoin institutionally as well through NATO and then the European Union, the European civilized community. The change happened at the early in 2000. I can tell you the episode from an American perspective which was that in 2001, he was in America, but he did not get an invitation from the White House, which offended him deeply. But aside from that, more importantly, the White House sent so-called diplomats would know, and so-called non-paper to the Hungarian government, to Mr. Orbán and Mr. Marton, who was the foreign minister at the time, and they did not get an answer. So at that point, I was consulted on that issue, and I was asked to call Mr. Orbán, my good friend, still at that time, and there was no response. Then I understood that a big change took place. Why this big change is an important question to which I don't have an answer. There is a lot of speculation about Russian influence, about dossiers being transferred to Moscow. That's something they know about. I don't think that's a critical issue here. The critical issue is authority, which matters to him. He didn't like to take any advice or from his own father. I went with him to Feldshut in the 90s. I think I understand that his issue has to do with power on the one hand and authority on the other. And I think the West has a tendency to lecture countries, including Orbán's Hungary, and he rebelled against it. And Mr. Putin and even now the Chinese understand this better, and they handle him better as a result. So he turned right, first moderate right, and then far right. In terms of Hungarian history, he is in line with tendencies that were apparent in the interwar period, the Horthy regime, and then the Kádár regime too. But that would be an academic subject that perhaps we should do another time. But some years later, he turned against the European Union, of which he wanted so badly to be a member, and some of you will remember what he said at the time: there is life beyond the European Union. Why a relatively small country, how very important it may be to me, would do this is beyond my understanding, but he wanted to be sovereign. He didn't want anybody to tell him what to do, and it resonated with the Hungarian public. That's important to keep in mind, especially in the West. You know, we talk about Orbán and Orbán. You know, yes, that's a major issue, but the public is behind him. In any case, against this background, if I may just mention one other thing. Finally, the EPP, the conservative bloc, the EU, pushed him out, but even that has not been enough. And so now there is a movement in Brussels to take corruption seriously, to take the rule of law issues seriously, and a few other issues as well, which I will not go into that. Certainly one should be the ambivalent attitude of this government towards the crisis in Ukraine, which I think is a watershed event in current history, but maybe in all of history. Now, it appears that the Hungarian government is prepared to take a step back, to make some compromises, to appoint a committee of independence and of his own people to handle this. I'm somewhat skeptical about this, but I still think it is possible. On the economic front, I'll take another 2 or 3 minutes if that's okay.
2 minutes, yeah.
Thank you. that it is possible that Hungary will lose a part of all the subsidies and grants that the EU has provided. And one estimate that I more or less take seriously is that approximately 30% less money will come here from the EU in the years ahead than at the present time. That's a substantial amount if you take into account that about 3% of the Hungarian GDP comes from the EU. So if that's reduced to 2%, add to that the inflation and the energy crisis, you will have a catastrophic economic condition emerging in this country. But economics is not the only thing. There is the question of what will follow that, whether Hungary's Schengen rights will continue. A number of other questions. I'll skip that, but I'll mention one other last point that has not been mentioned in the debates in this country either. And that has to do with the Orbán government's very curious response to an underlying extremely important national issue, and that has to do with how to overcome in a peaceful way the trauma of Trianon that is an important part of the Hungarian psyche. What I have in mind here is after World War I, Hungary lost 2/3 of its territory. This was an excessive punishment, and I say this not as I'm not a Hungarian citizen anymore. I'm an American citizen, speaking only for myself. And only the European Union can provide some limited remedies to this old trauma, and it escapes my imagination of why neither why this government dismisses the issue, doesn't take it up, and why the opposition doesn't exploit this possibility. What I have to conclude, I will just say that the EU is badly needed for Hungary, much more than Hungary is needed for the EU. And reason is primarily economics, the subsidies, the grants, etc. But also, if a Hungarian government wants to take seriously the loss occurred after World War I, that approximately 5 million ethnic Hungarians live abroad, and how to bring them closer together to the Hungarian nation, I think they need the European Union very badly.
Thank you very much. Professor Fukuyama, you recently wrote a book about liberalism and its discounters, who are many and coming from very different opinions on the political spectrum. According to you, what is the influence of this Hungarian government and its prime minister on the conservative right in the United States and in Europe? I'm particularly interested in what is the echo of Viktor Orbán and his policies in the United States, because as you probably know, he was a speaker at the 2022 CPAC in Texas, and here in Budapest, for the first time, a European CPAC took place this year, so this seems to be an important issue.
Yes, so thank you very much. I'm sorry I can't be with you in person, but it's a great honor to be part of this panel. So it's true that for a small country, Hungary and Viktor Orbán have had an enormous global impact, and particularly on American conservatives. You know, Steve Bannon, who was Trump's first strategist, called Orbán Trump before Trump, Tucker Carlson, the most watched TV host on Fox News, broadcast an episode from Budapest. Rod Dreher, another conservative intellectual, moved to Hungary for a few months to talk about how great the regime that Orban was creating was. Donald Trump, of course, refers to him as a close friend. And then, as you said, the CPAC meeting in Dallas this past September featured Orban as a speaker, where he got a standing ovation. I think the reason that he's popular in the American right is twofold. First, he's been able to articulate outright what a lot of people on the extreme right were thinking, but were not really free to say openly, and he has mainstreamed these ideas. And he's also provided a living example of what they would like to see in the United States. Now, we don't think of Orban as an intellectual or a theorist, but he actually has been a major promoter of certain abstract ideas that American conservatives haven't been able to fully articulate, and I think there are 5 of them. The first is just the idea of illiberal democracy. His famous speech in Băi Tușnad in Romania in 2014 was the first articulation of this idea that you could be a democracy, hold elections, and use that democratic mandate to dismantle the liberal part of liberal democracy. At that speech, he celebrated Singapore, India, China, Russia, and Turkey. Only India would really qualify at that time as a full liberal democracy. And he was saying that there were alternative, more authoritarian models of governance that he was imitating and that we should look up to. Second idea that he promoted is the idea of Western civilization as one based on Christianity, or at best a Judeo-Christian heritage. This had been an issue, in the negotiations over the European Constitution, where some conservatives wanted to refer to Europe's Christian heritage, but Orban fully articulated this as the basis of what the West was. My understanding, actually, is what the West represents is the liberalism that emerged after the European wars of religion, that explicitly said that religion would not be the basis of the liberal Enlightenment, but would be a more universalist doctrine. But Orban is taking us back to a time before that liberal Enlightenment project occurred. The third idea has to do with Hungarian national identity being based on Hungarian ethnicity, which again he has stated quite openly. This crosses a line by using race as a source of identity, something that he has doubled down on in his recent speech, where he attacked race mixing as something that Hungarians wouldn't do. Now, I don't have to explain why this is problematic, but let me just give you one example in terms of Hungarian history. There's this famous meeting of 4 great physicists with Franklin Roosevelt in the course of the Manhattan Project: Edward Teller, Leo Szilard, John von Neumann, and Eugene Wigner. And all of them had, it turned out, gone to the same gymnasium in Budapest, and all of them were Jews. And by Orban's definition, they're not Hungarians. And it does seem to me that a lot of the greatness of Hungary was really due to the fact that it was part of a liberal Austro-Hungarian empire that actually did a lot of race mixing and benefited from that diversity. It also creates a potential foreign policy problem because of the number of ethnic Hungarians living outside of Hungary, something that Charles just alluded to. I don't think it's an accident that Orban has given his most controversial speeches in Transylvania. So the third issue is redefining the role of the state. An older generation of American conservatives were economic liberals, meaning that they wanted to cut the state back. They didn't want state-owned companies. They didn't want state regulation. This was really the basis of Reaganism. And I think Orban and Hungary were the first really to push for an activist state to defend what he considered to be Hungarian national interests in terms of the banking sector and really a defense of a kind of economic nationalism. And this has actually been a transformation that's been happening in the United States, where that older generation of Reagan libertarian conservatives is now morphing into a national conservative movement that's very happy to use state power to dictate what's taught in schools, to control so-called woke corporations and cut back their freedom of action and so forth. And this is a really major change in the nature of American conservatism that was pioneered by Orban and Hungary. Then the final issue really has to do with sympathy for Putin and Putin's Russia. I think that the thing that binds populist nationalists around the world together, Matteo Salvini, Eric Zemmour, Marine Le Pen, Donald Trump, is their admiration for Putin. And I think this really is it's a sign of a longing for the kind of illiberal authoritarian government that Putin represents, where he's not constrained by courts, by the media, by other checks and balances. And, this is what makes, in a way, what joins all of these together. So just to conclude, American conservatives like Hungary and Orban, because he has said out loud many of the things that they have been thinking, and he's articulated it in a very clear way, particularly the open advocacy of Christianity as the basis of their political order. And he is giving them an actual country which they can imagine embodies all of the virtues that they seek. And I think that's had a very telling effect on the evolution of conservatism, extreme conservatism in the U.S.
Thank you so much, Professor Fukuyama. I now like to ask Kati Marton, who is also online with us, what's your point of view, which is the point of view of Action for Democracy, which is an NGO, on the current situation of human rights and what's wrong, if there is anything wrong in this country with regard to the rules set by the EU in the domain of human rights and freedom.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Camus. And I just want to, because I have only a few minutes to say a great deal, say how honored I am to be part of this panel and to commend and thank the Mayor of Budapest for, as well as CEU, for organizing such an important conversation at this particular time. My friend and colleague, Professor Gati, started us off on such an apocalyptic mood that I'm still trying to recover from the forecast of imminent doom. But let me just say, I'm one of those rare Hungarians, and Budapest is also my hometown, that is an optimist. And I see a silver lining in the great discomfort in which Viktor Orban finds himself at the moment. I, too, know Orban, or knew him when he was quite a different personality, but I can assure you that he is a non-ideological politician. Putin is very similar in that Putin is also an opportunist. I spent more hours than I like to recall in the presence of Slobodan Milosevic, another opportunist. That is to say that all of these characters are about one thing, and that's power and maintaining themselves in power. And there is opportunity in that. And that is that this war is not going well. The hot war next door to Hungary. And by the way, I am devastated that I'm not with you there in my hometown, but had a booking a conflict. But at any rate, this war is a hot war, and Orban is a culture warrior. He likes to talk about the problem with immigrants, with refugees, with the LGBTQ community. And none of those issues are relevant at the moment. And therefore, in his opportunism, there is opportunity for the EU to finally rein him in. Yes, it's true that Hungary is a small landlocked country, but Hungary now, as has been said by Frank and by Charles, Hungary punches above its weight politically because Orban has become the poster child of the American extreme right wing. But he is not the poster child elsewhere in Europe. He is, I don't see his brand of populism spreading. In haste, would like to say that I don't see the trauma of Trianon as being a burning issue. What I do see as a burning issue, and here again the EU can play a role in asserting a rights for an independent media in Hungary, because it all starts with a media which is now 90% Orban media, and therefore you have a stupid population. I'm sorry to say that, but you have an ignorant population that is susceptible to the mythologizing of Orban. You have this parallel situation, obviously, in Russia. So the EU has the opportunity now, because Orban is in great difficulties, and the world changed on February 24th when Putin sent his forces into Ukraine. And even since Orban's re-election, the world has changed. And he predicted that the West was on its last legs. Well, Europe has never been more unified than it is at the moment. This was not Orban's scenario. Orban absolutely needs the European Union. Orban's best friend cannot be the man who considers the fall of the Soviet Empire as the greatest catastrophe of the 20th century, when Viktor Orban and anybody over 40 in Hungary owes their second chance at life and at freedom to the demise of the Soviet Empire. So it makes no sense, but the European Union has to finally rein him in on the media, on the judiciary, and obviously on corruption. But what I started to say was that the bigger issue, bigger historically, much more immediate than Trianon, is that Hungary has not yet dealt with its own dark history. My grandparents, good Hungarians, we've been there for 100 years and more, were helped onto the Auschwitz-bound trains by their fellow Hungarians. Hungary has not confronted that history. As a result, it's susceptible to the likes of populists such as Viktor Orban. So that has to be part of the EU's message to Hungary. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Professor Bruszt, just before we started this panel, we were discussing two topics. The first one is Viktor Orban really, we say, the one who was setting the pace for the populist far right in Europe? Is he really a trendsetter? This is the first point. And the second point is, who stands behind him and gives him the knowledge of the European situation? Who are the theorists behind his political actions? Can you name a few intellectuals who have been of some influence over your Prime Minister and who have shaped this policy of influence on the European far right?
Thank you. I will be brief because I would like to leave also time, hopefully, for some Q&A part, if possible. Now, on your question, I agree with Kati Marton that Orban is not a trendsetter, not at least in the European setting, that a European far right or the extreme right admires him because he could get in power and stay in power for 12 years. He has resources, he has infrastructural power to help them, and therefore his popularity in these circles is high. But if you look at the major issues that are important for far right, are issues in which he is either following other steps or others ideologue steps, or he is unable to create alliances. Give you a few examples. The sovereignism that is very important, for example, in southern and Western Europe for several of the right to the EPP parties. In sovereignism, he was talking in 2012 first about Hungary not becoming or doesn't want to become the colony of the European Union. But he was not the first to use this language. Syriza, 2 years before him, used this language. If you look at migration, the first anti-migration slogans were directed against white Christian Europeans in France or in UK when they were talking about the against free movement of labor. If you look at the issue of economic nationalism, again, he was not inventing something new. In economic nationalism, actually his policies clash with, and not just economic nationalism, issues of anti-federalism, or what he calls against the empire. What he talks is ideas clash with the southern member state, right-wing, the extreme right, with Salvini or others. The South would like to have less regulation in the monetary and the regulatory field. This is for an FDI-based economy like Hungary or Poland. This is an anathema. They would like to have less intervention in the spending of the EU money. So there are lots of such differences that prevent him being a trendsetter. On your second question, very briefly, he was very much influenced in the early stage of his post-2010 prime ministership by two people. One was Gyula Tellér, the other was László Bogár. Both of them extreme right ideologues, having a mythical anti-globalist ideas about global deep power, deep state, and transnational conspiracy, about use of the extension of global market to siphon away resources and opportunities from Hungary or from these countries, economic nationalism, and he took a lot from them. Actually, Tellér made even a link between economic nationalism or sovereignism and the problems with multi-party democracy. That is saying that the most important thing to keep the sovereignty, economic sovereignty of the country, to have more room for national level decision, is to have stable, balanced budget and good evaluation by the bond markets. But that is undermined by competition, political competition, or it's weakened by competition that forces competing parties to overreach, to focus on redistribution. So therefore this managed competition or managed democracy might be a way actually to increase sovereignty, things like that. But it's very important influences on him.
Thank you very much. Mathieu Lefèvre, I know you have to leave shortly, so You are the CEO of More in Common, an NGO which has published extensively on the reasons why people vote for authoritarian parties. Can you please explain some of the findings of those studies?
Yes. Hi, everyone. And it's really great to be here. It's a real honor to be on this panel. And I, too, am sorry that I can't be with you in beautiful Budapest, because there might be a lot of things wrong with Hungary, but the beauty of Budapest is certainly not one of them. So I would have loved to be there. I will be very brief, because I know we're short on time. So as you were saying, Jean-Yves, the group that I work for, we do extensive polling, and we try to understand the psychology of audiences. So I'm going to try to draw on some of our research to make 2 points. The first point is that I think what is often missing in these discussions is an element to understand the demand side of the equation. Technocratic solutions from the EU, from the European Parliament are very top-down and very technocratic. And actually, if you do extensive polling like we do on thousands of people, you see that really nobody thinks in those terms. People think in much more emotional perception terms. And specifically, I think that policy solutions, whether they come from the European Union, whether they come from international actors, or whether they come from the Hungarian opposition, are going to miss a beat unless they understand the psychology of audiences which make up the bulk of the voting share for parties like Fidesz, or like Law and Justice, or like the National Rally in France. And so I think without an understanding of that psychology of who votes and who supports Orbán and his enduring appeal, I think your technocratic solutions risk sort of being not effective, but they can also be very counterintuitive and counterproductive. They can actually create a backlash and not serve their intended result. So I'll just share a few of the sort of attributes of the psychology of these low trust groups that we've mapped out quite extensively. So typically they make up about 1/3 of national populations across Europe. So roughly 1 in 3 people, I'm not talking about registered voters, I'm talking about people, fall into this group that I'm about to describe. And what these groups share is that they have very low interpersonal trust. They are very much looking for what social psychologists call an in-group. I'll come back to the notion of the out-group, but they're looking for a sense of community. They're looking for a sense of belonging. They typically have fewer personal interactions per week or per month than the average. So they're quite lonely and isolated. Another thing that distinguishes this audience is that they feel that they have lost their voice. Nobody is speaking for them. Nobody is in their corner to fight for them. They feel unheard. And that's true of the Yellow Vest, it's true of the Law and Justice Party supporters, it's true of a broad variety of groups, but I would be curious from our Hungarian friends if that really applies. Certainly in our research, that definitely applies to that core Fidesz voter. The other thing, and this really ties into what many of you on the panel have been referring to, is that this group doesn't necessarily have a very precise understanding of their own history, but they have a sense of nostalgia. They long for some sort of golden past. And so activating any kind of mythological identity, which many other panelists have referred to, and Professor Fukuyama was talking about the use of Christianity as that vector for that identity, is very powerful to activate that group. And finally, this group struggles to understand the world around them unless there is somebody to blame. And I think this is where all of the leaders, but particularly Viktor Orbán, have been brilliant in identifying who to blame in that sort of us versus them frame. Migrants. He was blaming migrants before it was fashionable to among the far right. LGBTQ community, the EU, et cetera, et cetera. So the point I want to make is that I would encourage all of you in your efforts, whether in government, in politics, in academia, to bring in that audience lens, because unless you understand these groups, everything else doesn't really resonate and is often missing from the equation. The second point I want to make very briefly is that I think there are two opportunities in the short term, and others on the panel, Kati and others have referred to this, and they're linked, obviously. The first one is the cost of living crisis. Cost of living is the only game in town in Europe, and it will be the only game in town for the next year, at least. That is all people care about. It has shot up to #1 in people's priorities in every country in the EU. Nobody expects this to be a short-lived crisis. So, for example, the way that the Law and Justice Party is dealing with the cost of living crisis is leading to a collapse in support for them. They're at 32% polling of support. So the way Viktor Orban deals with the cost of living crisis is going to be critically important. And here I think it's an opportunity to put pressure there from the EU through the funds for the opposition. I think the opposition has to message very carefully on cost of living crisis. People want short-term support. They want to understand who's to blame. They want to understand the solutions. And this brings me to the second opportunity, which is that I think, but I am supremely less qualified than others on the panel, but I think Viktor Orban has made a mistake on Russia. Low-trust audiences across Europe blame Russia for the invasion of Ukraine. That has led, Jean-Yves, you know this much better than I do, but Eric Zemmour's position on Russia led to the collapse, or contributed to the collapse of his campaign. Marine Le Pen has had to walk back comments. Giorgia Meloni, who could be the next prime minister of Italy, has walked back comments. And so, of course, the Law and Justice Party, that's their big difference in my understanding with Hungary. And I think, low trust groups all over Europe blame Russia for what's going on. They are not siding with Russia. And so there's a real opportunity here to peel back support because of Orban's position on Russia. So with that, I'll end, but really to thank you very much, and also to thank the mayor for organizing this, because Hungary may be a small country, but it's enormously symbolically important to this fight that we're all in. So I'm very grateful to have been here with you.
Thank you very much. It's up to the organizers to tell me if we will have time for a short Q&A session. Anyway, the last word is to Professor Timothy Garton. My question is, at the end of the day, do you think that the EU is taking a new approach to the Hungarian situation? Has something changed in Brussels with regard of how to cope with what's going on here?
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be with you virtually at this very, really important gathering, and I'm looking forward to being with you physically in Budapest next month, presenting the Hungarian edition of my book on free speech, which has something to do with the defense of democracy. Let me first just reflect very briefly on the tragic fact that the EU, which defines itself as a community of democracies, a democratic community of democracies, has actually facilitated the erosion of democracy in Hungary over the last 12 years more than it has hindered it. In some respects it's hindered it, but it's facilitated it more. Why? Partly unavoidable, unintended consequences of the very nature of the EU. If you have a single market, German car industry will see an opportunity to invest in Hungary. If you have freedom of movement, many energetic, liberal, pro-European Hungarians will go and live elsewhere in the European Union. Those are in some sense unavoidable consequences. But I think there are two main reasons. One is the biggest asset for Viktor Orban from the EU has been the money, the billions of euros. It's not just, as Charles Gati said, 1% of GDP, or 3% of GDP in total. It's that the money goes directly to central government. Far too little of it goes to the city of Budapest. And since central government in Hungary means Fidesz, it in effect becomes a vast patronage fund for Fidesz. Why has the EU been so effective in preventing that? For two reasons. One, because the EU is still bears the marks of its origins as a European economic community. And what it has, the values expressed in Article 2 of the Treaty of the European Union have been, so to speak, retrofitted into the economic community. But the linkage until now has not effectively been made between the Europe money and the Europe of values. And secondly, because of a political dysfunction of this union, which has, I think, very quickly three aspects. Number one, we thought about democratic conditionality for accession countries. There was a whole lot of conditionality for accession countries. We didn't think at all about conditionality for member states. Secondly, what Dan Kellerman calls partial politicization. The creation of European political parties like the EPP was intended to democratize the EU at the EU level. The way in which the EPP hung on to the Fidesz votes actually facilitated the erosion of democracy inside Hungary. So something that was intended to improve the democratic quality of the EU actually facilitated the erosion of democracy in a member state, namely Hungary. And thirdly, and almost most important, because key decisions are still made intergovernmentally in the European Council. The European Council is a club of heads of government. And in clubs, members don't like criticizing each other. It's hail fellow, well met. Classic example, Jean-Claude Juncker, after a few glasses of wine, greeting Viktor Orban, saying, "Hello, dictator," ha, ha, ha. But it's also a club where members depend on each other to get the things they want. I need Orban's vote to get my structural funding for the south of France or the south of Italy or whatever else. And it's a club where sometimes you need, quite formally, unanimity. That has given enormous positional power to Viktor Orban, which he's used extremely well. Result, for years, the EU has looked at this increasingly black sheep and tried to pretend that it's a white sheep, or at least a brown sheep, which may be the most appropriate color for the current government. Now, is this changing? Yes, but be careful. It's changing because of the cumulative effect of the work that I'd like to say many of us have done, that you in Hungary have done, the European Parliament has done, many outstanding scholars and journalists have done, and Central and East European member states have done, to draw attention to this scandal, that you have a member of the European Union which is not a democracy anymore. But crucially, it's Ukraine. The war in Ukraine has done two things. First of all, it has focused the whole attention of Europe on Central and Eastern Europe, defined as a struggle of democracy against dictatorship. So the problem of having a member state of the EU which isn't a democracy acquires great prominence. Secondly, as several speakers already mentioned, Orban's own position on the war in Ukraine, his really outrageous disloyalty towards the West, his having his cake and eat it, his meetings with Putin, have alienated almost everybody else in the EU, but particularly they've destroyed the unity of the Visegrad Four. So if I slightly add a footnote to what Francis Fukuyama said, not all populists have sympathy with Putin. Polish populists don't, and Czech populists don't. And so it's actually broken that unity, which is a great strength of Orban's. So to that extent, I think we can be hopeful. The Commission has quite a rigorous position, although narrowly defined on rule of law and corruption. So unfortunately, it doesn't actually go to the larger issues of media pluralism, Kati, or of democracy as such. But be careful, because the factors I have described, the structural factors I have described, are still quite powerfully present in the basic functioning of the EU, both economically and politically. So let's not have the illusion that the EU is going to be, so to speak, the knight in shining armor on a white horse riding to spear the black sheep. The EU is not going to save democracy in Hungary. That's going to be up now as ever to the Hungarians. but I hope the EU may help a little bit more.
Thank you so much for this great panel. We now have 10 minutes for a Q&A session. I think there's a microphone ready to go to all of you who want to ask a question to our panelists. So please. Yes, please, short questions and questions only.
Thank you, Peter Molnar. Short question, but before that I have to say that I think, with full respect, that the statement that Orbán would think that the 4 Jewish Hungarian scientists are not Hungarians goes too far. I think that he wouldn't say that, he wouldn't think so, just for the sake of fairness. I'm not defending him, not the government. My quick question is to Kati Marton, who said that, but others as well, that she thought that the Orbán and his government is not ideologist. And I respectfully disagree. It seems to me that while power is certainly a self-purpose as well, but it's also an instrument for Hungarian nationalism. And I think it's related to what Professor Gati said about Trianon. And so I'm asking for mostly Kati, but also Professor Gati and others, whether they would agree that what we face is not just an empty, 100% cynical run for power and money, but there is a goal as well. Because if we want to debate that, if we want to push it back, if we want to compete for the hearts and minds against it, we need to get it right, what it is. Thank you.
Thank you. Another question?
Thank you very much for such a spectacular panel. And I will try and make this question very quick, but it's very similar to yours. And I was going to say that, yes, it's about cost of living. That's the game in town. But I was going to go back to Professor Gati's reflection upon Trianon. And yes, I have to agree with Kati Marton as well. Unfortunately, the Holocaust, the Hungarian Holocaust, and Auschwitz being a Hungarian cemetery should be considered as such, is not as deep as our psyche as it should be. But I would like to kind of ask you, with due respect, Professor Gati, to expand on how the EU, how you see the EU's role in solving the Trianon trauma, because I agree with you perfectly. I think Orbán's brilliance was in weaponizing Trianon as well, in particular with the Transylvanian minority, and I'm Transylvanian here, because he managed to get that community, understand the emotional triggers of that community perfectly, and get a base of electorate that is standing by him until death do us part at this moment, which is what the opposition unfortunately failed to see and to react to. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I saw a gentleman just behind you raise his hand. Yes, please.
Thank you. My question would be, Professor Fukuyama mentioned that Christianity plays an important role in Orbán's policy, especially the illiberal Christian part. And we can see this with many autocratic leaders weaponizing religion and using it to further their goals. And Orbán also mentions very importantly that Christian, or the illiberal Christian version of Europe, is the antidote to the Islamic migration pressure. And of course this is a very dangerous argument, and the question is, would secularism as an idea, or humanism, be the real solution to creating a society where no ideological influence can destroy the idea of Europe? And if secularism is the answer, how can we create a secular future?
Thank you so much. So I think we really come to the end of this panel, unless you have something to add very, very briefly. Any one of you? If not, let me thank the organizers for inviting me here. We had a great panel with very prominent intellectuals and people who really know what's happening in this country. So it was an honor to be your moderator, and that's the end of this panel. Have a good evening.
Thank you. Have a good evening.